But let me just explain here. This is a good example, again, why we have this issue of governments doing things that they think that are good ideas, but actually unintended consequences, but yielding bad outcomes. So we've been all convinced, well, certainly people like me, that trade was a good thing. We needed to open our economies. And basically, the idea was that if we opened the economy, people in the United States and Europe were way ahead. They knew how to make T-shirts, televisions, and so on, and they were going to sell their goods to the Chinese, to the Indians, and so on. And it sounded like a great proposition, because we all thought that incomes would arise. Well, what exactly happened? Why is it the case, if you look at data now, that Western countries have not benefited from globalization? There's a great paper from professors at the University of Chicago that compare the 1950 to the 1980s, which is the time when the United States was pretty closed, to the 1980s to 2007, when the U.S. was pretty open. And actually, on a GDP growth basis, income growth was the same, 2.1%. So for us as economists, we think, how can that be? How can it be that economically it makes sense for a closed economy and an open economy to have the same level of economic growth? Well, you'll be aware that real incomes of labor workers, people working in the United States, have been flat, so there's been no benefit there. And actually, income inequality in the United States has widened. So in its totality, the question is, why has there been a problem? Why do we not have the benefits that we expected? Well, to me, this is a classic example again of unintended consequences. What happened in the 1980s to 2007 was that the U.S. government, again driven by the idea of housing for everybody, created an artificial environment of low interest rates and also guarantees and subsidies through the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac network that actually encouraged people to take their incomes and invest their money in the housing market. Now, you might say, well, Dambisa, getting a house, having a roof over your head is a good thing. But it's not actually necessarily the case that it would be. There is actually a very good reason why governments should look at housing like any other asset class. Why should a government distort the housing sector to encourage us to put our money into housing as opposed to commodities or bonds or stocks or cash? That's not the role of government, but that's exactly what happened. And so what you found is that Americans who took about 30%, many cases much higher, of their wealth, invested it in the housing market. We know what happened there. But that also means that Americans missed out on the big trade, which was the emerging markets. And this comes back to the point of income inequality. Because what you found is that there is a big split between the people who own capital in the United States who have benefited, what are known as platform companies. So these are people who own capital. They've invested, American companies that have invested offshore and have gained quite significantly. And there's a big difference between them, the owners of capital, and the owners of labor, who have ended up in a situation where they've got more debt, real incomes have been flat, and they've ended up with their monies tied up in housing, having missed out on the big financial upside of the emerging markets. So how does this fit into total factor productivity? Well, you basically have lost the competitive edge, as we know. Where are we today? We've got about 30 million Americans out of work in the manufacturing sector. And this leads us to a very unstable equilibrium, because we do have to deal with the question, what are we going to do with a 10% unemployment rate? So let me just very quickly go through some of what I see as the options. I keep calling it, in the book I call it America's Hobson's Choice. I think that the United States has a very, very difficult choice. And the choice, I believe, is the following. The United States can continue to stay open, and by that I mean support and encourage the movement of capital, labor, and trade. Or she could become much more closed, much more protectionist. Now, people like me are very supportive of the idea of a much more open, participatory global economy where global flows move around. And it's very clear at this point in time that the United States has decided to try and solve this big intractable problem: education, performance, infrastructure, energy efficiency issues, within the framework of being open to the rest of the world. However, I would argue that that is a very big problem that the United States is facing. I simply do not think that, and I hate to say this, that Americans are competitive in a lot of areas, and particularly manufacturing. The world absolutely still is happy to pay a premium to the United States for sciences and technology, but the fact of the matter is that the world can find cheaper production of manufacturing goods, and arguably at of the same quality. The programs like that President Obama has embarked on, things like the American Reinvestment Program, which is about $45 billion towards infrastructure. I think it's more than that now. Programs like the education program, the 3% of U.S. GDP towards education and science and technology. All those are great programs, but they are way too small and marginal to matter. The United States has to be much more aggressive, and I would argue that she really has to start to think very strategically about whether or not the United States should continue to underwrite global economic goods. So things like policing the sea lanes. We benefit, we as an international citizens who are not American, but at some point it could be self-destroying for the United States if you continue to pay for the sea lanes, protection of the sea lanes globally, but at the expense of your education and your infrastructure and so on. There's another problem with staying open, and that is it relies very crucially on everybody else playing fair. Now, the fact of the matter is people don't. We know that there's an ongoing fight between the United States and China regarding China's moving the exchange rate. Fact of the matter is I don't think the Chinese are going to move their exchange rate materially. They have 1 billion people who live in the most horrific economic poverty that you can imagine. In the book, I call it the race from the revolution. That is absolutely what China's focused on right now. They have to make sure they don't have a revolution, and the only way they can do that is by providing jobs and economic growth for those people. And I don't believe that the story of America's story is or concerns are compelling enough for China. So I would love for the United States to be open. I don't see how you get out of this. I don't see how those 30 million jobs come back. They might have to do, some of you will remember in the 1970s in Britain, things got so bad that people had 3-day weeks, working 3 days a week. I think one of the difficulties of the United States is that you've never had structural unemployment. High levels of unemployment. In Spain, there's 20% unemployment right now. And people in Europe, in Africa, Asia, elsewhere, Latin America, are relatively used to survival in a structural unemployment position. This is something that has not happened in the United States to this degree. Let me just very quickly go to the other option, which is much more unpalatable, I think, for people like myself, and this is that America becomes much more protectionist. Now, it's interesting because a few years ago, I think it was only sort of crackpots and the psychotics which were viewed as people would be supporting the idea of more protectionism. And I just want to remind you that it's not such a far cry to go into protectionism. The United States already, certainly in the realm of agriculture, as we know through the Farm Bill, and Europe, Europe also through the Common Agriculture Policy have engaged in very aggressive protectionist policies, certainly against African countries who are simply not able to sell agriculture products into Europe or in the United States. Why am I mentioning that? Because I don't think the leap to becoming much more protectionist is something that is so crazy or out there. And if you look at some of the studies, there's one study I was looking at that says 30% of college education Americans now actually are more in support of some form of protectionism. and there are great concerns about this. Now, as an international citizen, I don't want America to be more protectionist and more closed off. But at the same time, it's clearly an option. It's something that is absolutely on the table. And if you cannot come up with a solution to reduce the unemployment rate in a meaningful way, I think it's absolutely that it's something on the table.